So, you probably think you know the story of the ancient Persian Empire, right? They're usually cast as the villains in Greek history, the faceless bad guys at Thermopylae. But what if that story, the one we all know, is really only one side of the coin? And the stories that have come down to us, like this one about a vengeful queen, they paint this picture of a dramatic, brutal, almost legendary enemy. I mean, what an incredible scene, right? But it makes you wonder, who's actually telling this story? Well, it turns out that this incredible story, and actually most of what the Western world has traditionally known about Persia, it comes from one main source, a Greek writer from a place called Halicarnassus. His name was Herodotus, and he's often called the father of history. Now, this guy, Herodotus, he traveled all over the place collecting these amazing tales that were meant to be read out loud at big festivals, sometimes even at the Olympic Games. He really knew how to grab an audience with these vivid stories about war and crazy prophecies and all these strange faraway lands. But, and this is a big but, here's the problem. Even people back then called Herodotus an inventor of fables. And for modern historians, it's this huge dilemma. He's totally indispensable, but he's also, well, kind of unreliable. You see, he's writing history, but he's also putting on a show. So that brings up a really big question, right? If our main storyteller is biased, how in the world do we find the real Persia? Well, to answer that, we have to look for what the Persians themselves left behind. And to find that voice, we have to turn away from the Greek scrolls and look at clay tablets and these massive stone carvings, because that's where the Persians recorded their own version of history. Okay, take the famous Cyrus cylinder, for example. In the Greek stories, Cyrus the Great is this totally ruthless conqueror. But then you have this thing, this clay artifact that he ordered to be made, and it tells a completely different story. It doesn't talk about a brutal conquest of Babylon. No, it describes a peaceful liberation. It even claims that the city's own god Marduk personally chose Cyrus to come in and restore order. And this right here, this is a perfect example of the problem. Let's look at the rise of King Darius. Herodotus gives us this amazing, dramatic story about an imposter on the throne. And guess what? Darius tells the exact same story, and even has it carved 100 meters high on the side of a cliff. But here's the twist. A lot of historians now think Darius himself just made up the whole imposter story to justify seizing the throne from the real heir. It's an absolute masterclass in ancient propaganda. So, when we actually look past the battles and all the propaganda, what do we find? Well, you find a civilization that was so much more than just a war machine. I mean, get this. At its absolute peak, the Persian Empire was just vast. It ruled over an estimated 20% of the entire world's population. Seriously, think about that for a second. 1 in every 5 people on the planet lived under Persian rule. It was the largest, most diverse empire the world had ever seen up to that point. They were also obsessed with gardens. They created these beautiful walled-in gardens, these paradisa, and they were so impressive to Greek travelers that the Greeks borrowed the word, and it eventually became our word, paradise. So that whole idea of a perfect walled-off piece of nature, like a private Garden of Eden, yeah, that was a Persian export. And their whole culture was built on ideas that honestly still feel pretty modern. They valued truth above pretty much everything else. They built something called the Royal Road, which was this incredible highway system with relay stations, a blueprint for fast communication for centuries. And maybe most important, their whole model for an empire was incredibly multicultural for its time. Instead of forcing their culture on people, they actually adopted the best ideas and technologies from the people they ruled. And you gotta love this, they had this unique way to test out big decisions. Debate the issue once while drunk, and then again when you're sober. And if the idea still seemed good, it was a go. Okay, so this all brings us back to that famous war with Greece. But when you look at it with all this new context, from the Persian side, the story changes completely. From the Greek perspective, it's a simple story about a fight for freedom. But from the Persian point of view, it began when a bunch of Greek-speaking cities in their territory, in a place called Ionia, revolted. And then Athens, which was a totally separate outside power, decided to meddle. They sent troops who helped the rebels burn the major Persian city of Sardis to the ground. For Persia, this wasn't just some battle. This was an act of, well, international arson, totally unprovoked, and for them, unforgivable. And that insult, the burning of Sardis, King Darius would never forget it.
In fact, he was so furious, he ordered a servant to stand by him at every single meal and repeat those words, "Master, remember the Athenians." He turned the entire conflict into a personal, multi-generational quest for revenge.
Okay, so if the Persian side of the story is this compelling, why do we almost only ever hear the Greek version? Why does this huge, powerful, influential empire seem so quiet?
Well, the answer really comes down to how they remembered their own history. You see, unlike the Greeks, who wrote everything down in these long narrative histories, the Persians had a totally different tradition. They relied on a revered class of oral storytellers. I mean, these weren't just guys telling stories. These singers and poets would memorize and perform these epic tales about gods and heroes, passing them from one generation to the next through just astonishing feats of memory. But when that oral tradition eventually died out, the Persian side of the story, well, it just faded into silence.
And that leaves us with a really challenging thought. We have that old saying, right? History is written by the victors. But maybe the story of Persia suggests a little correction. Maybe history isn't always written by the victors, but just by whoever's left to write it down.